Hello there, welcome to Plus Talk on Plus Life, where we're all about turning positive into a plus. ChemSex, PNP, high fun, party and play. What is it? What does it mean? And how does it affect those of us living with HIV? Joining me today in the Plus Life studio is Mell McCracken. You are a trauma-focused substance abuse counselor and ChemSex expert?
I suppose,
I
yes,
suppose.
yeah.
Thank you for joining me. This is a really important topic.
Yeah.
What is ChemSex? What is PNP? What is high fun?
Well, high fun, PNP, it means party and play. It's sexualized drug use. When I think about ChemSex, I think about, coffee and cigarettes, right? If you use two things together concurrently over a period of time, they kind of marry and they fuse together in the mind, and it becomes one thing, ChemSex.
And now, is ChemSex just relating to the use of methamphetamines and sort of GHB, or can it literally refer to marijuana and some of the things that we think are less of the bad drugs?
Absolutely. If there's any chemicals used to facilitate any sort of sexual setting, whether it's to alleviate anxieties or fears, so you may take more alcohol than normal, that is also ChemSex. Predominantly in our community, it's methamphetamine and GHB.
So studies show that folks living with HIV, and I touched on this just a second ago, those of us living with HIV, in particular, men who have sex with men, people like myself, we can turn to substances like meth and other chemicals, especially when it comes to sex and intimacy. Why do you think we're doing that, Mel?
Well, I think that there's a lot of unresolved trauma in our community, and I think it's a way to bypass shame. That toxic shame, maybe growing up in a religious environment, parental figures, disapproval, self-esteem, right? And lack of confidence. And sex and intimacy, I think, in our community are something that are compartmentalized in a lot of ways. I think about the adolescent experience of being a queer person. I'm a queer person. I never had that integration in my adolescent years in high school. I never took anyone to prom. I could never tell anyone who I had a crush on because it wasn't out. So all of my secretive behaviors around sexuality started to happen in adolescence and high school. But I had intimate friendships, so these two things were completely separate. And I think the same goes around ChemSex, which is I don't know how to be close to someone. I don't know what it means to have intimacy with another person because those two things were never integrated, which is a big part of the recovery process.
Yeah, and you touch on an interesting point there, which leads to one of my questions, which is, what roles do does living with multiple intersecting stigmatization identities? You pointed out being queer, people who might already use substance, and then you put in HIV.
Right.
So, someone like myself, I'm living with HIV, I've had all that internalized stigma.
Yeah.
You talk about it can be difficult for intimacy because of compartmentalizing, and then you throw in doing some drugs because it makes me feel good.
Well,
this intersectionality is a key part of this, isn't it?
Absolutely, because specifically around meth operates in a way of dissolving emotional consciousness. So if I have any unresolved emotional material or baggage, that I've been carrying and I haven't really worked through, I use something like meth and it's gone and my inhibitions are gone and I'm able to actually be my full sexual self. So they really kind of facilitate an opening for sex and sexuality for a lot of people.
Now, you could flip that and go, wow, that actually sounds great. I'm uptight. I am deeply battling internalized stigma. I am insecure about how I look and how I feel.
That's right.
Wow, there's a substance. I can do this thing. And it's going to make me feel all of those things.
Right.
Until it doesn't.
Until it doesn't, yeah. It usually
Can you
starts
talk a
that
bit
way.
more about that?
Yeah, I think ChemSex is a very slow progression, right? It may start with drinking a little bit too much and then going to a hookup party or, just using substances here and there where it's more spread out, right? Like I'm using meth once every 2 months. And then it starts to go to once every month. And then it starts to move into, twice a month. And this progression happens over years, right? And a lot of people don't think they're in an addictive cycle because it is so spread out. But if you look at a calendar of your history, you're actually in the addictive cycle. Just because you're not a daily user and not on the street shooting up every day doesn't mean that you're not addicted to drugs.
Yeah, well, look, I can speak from, personal experiences. ChemSex certainly made intimacy appear easier and euphoric, at least on the surface.
On the surface, right? But that deep, meaningful connection is unavailable if you're using substances.
Something I know I've said to myself, and I think a lot of people have said, and I've heard people say, is, well, meth and sex kept me from having to deal with life. And, you know, coming back to that point earlier, you get an HIV diagnosis, the internalized stigma, the external stigma, work, life, everything. I just want to go to life.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I can jump on the pipe and disappear for a couple of days, and I don't have to deal with it. How does ChemSex or PNP actually fuel the self-stigma and that self-loathing at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, the emotional consequences after use, right? Like despair, guilt, remorse, you know, making up for all of that you've lost in the past 4 days when you've been using. And you touched on something around HIV, right? And there is a very inclusive, positive culture in ChemSex users, right? And nobody's asking status, and I mean, nobody's really talking about any of that in ChemSex settings. But what starts to happen, and what I see happen more often than not, is people aren't taking their medications. They're going off for, you know, 4 to 5 days, and it's not like I just went out, got drunk, and then I forgot to take my meds in the morning. This is like extended periods of times without medication, and whether that's PrEP and you expose yourself, or whether that's, you know, current HIV meds, you can become treatment resistant, and that's really dangerous in the ChemSex population.
Yeah, and especially when we are trying to build up the U equals U undetectable equals untransmittable message.
Right.
But to your point, you know, when I have indulged in these activities, I haven't eaten for 4 days, let alone had a glass of water.
Right, dehydration
You know,
is a big thing,
you just, everything sort of shuts down in that regard.
Right.
Fortunately, I remember to take my meds, but, you know, everyone's different. You've said that people lose self-intimacy when in the throes of drug addiction, and self-intimacy, it's so important. Meth, as you've said, disables empathy, which is one of the tragic casualties.
Yeah, empathy is the way out. Healing is not from here. And when I don't have access to this, how can I expect myself to heal through empathy or intimacy or connection with another person? And that takes quite some time to come back online, like 30 to 45 days, before you start to thaw out and actually have an emotional consciousness again. So it's not just during use. It's after use.
And I don't think people realize the effect that meth use specifically has on your brain and how your brain works.
Yeah.
Sure, euphoric and high and whatever and libido for days. But can you just touch in as plain English as possible what it does to the brain and how long that takes for the brain to recover and heal?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm going to start with the last question first. There have been brain scans on, and this is not chronic meth users, these are people who use like once a month, that show your brain doesn't return to full cognition for about 18 months.
Wow.
So, and that's just someone who's using, you know, once a month. The damage that it does in the brain is right on the dopamine receptors, right? It actually prevents people from feeling oxytocin, which is what bonds us together. That is the connection, that is the intimacy, and there's a flood of dopamine. And the dopamine receptors become injured because they can't handle that much dopamine, which we see psychosis, we see psychiatric features, we see, you know, kind of the meth these days is, I want to call it instant crazy. Like, I work with people who present like they've been using for 20 years, but they've only been using for 2. And that's because meth has changed. It's not the meth that was here 10 years ago. It has been manufactured, and it's called P2P meth. And we're going from 2008, 30% purity, to 2023, 24, 100% purity. The brain can't handle that much.
And then you've got fentanyl in the mix too.
And every single person that I know that has used fentanyl test strips and that is a chronic user has tested their meth positive for fentanyl.
What do you think the biggest misconception is about ChemSex or party and play?
It's around the addictive cycle. Absolutely. I'm only using once a month.
I said that, you know, I said, oh, I've used it here and there, and I can put it down and walk away from it.
Yeah, I'm not a daily user, so I'm not addicted to this, right? Well, if you have cyclical use, you're in an addictive cycle.
when they say to you, well, how will I ever be able to have sober sex?
This is the biggest question that comes to me. Yes, you will be able to have sober sex. And I'm very honest about it. It is not going to feel like that. It will feel much different, and it will be on a much deeper, more meaningful level. But it's going to take time. Like, you know, the coffee and cigarettes. If I quit cigarettes and I have a cup of coffee in the morning, it's going to trigger my desire to have a cigarette. So if you're, you know, looking at sobriety, you put the substances down. But when you're looking at ChemSex, you need to put both down. There needs to be a period of abstinence. And this is a period of self-inquiry, self-reflection, really an investigation into who you are as a sexual human. Like, and I don't know that we ask ourselves that a lot. I know my orientation, what I'm attracted to, what I like.
Because there's stigma around it.
Absolutely.
And we've grown up to be told that's dirty and we don't talk about sex. And
Right.
so we've got to, I say this all the time on Plus Life, we have to normalize the conversations around sex.
Yes.
And celebrate sex.
Yes.
We're all here because people had sex.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely
Right?
right. And it is a celebration, but if you've just been moving from a blueprint that's been kind of handed down through a community that has a lot of unresolved trauma that's kind of being projected and then replayed, and not giving yourself the time to really explore what you like, what gets you off, like what are your fantasies outside of chemicals? What are you really looking for, and how do you want to be in the world as a sexual human? And that falls in line with AIDS and HIV, right?
Yeah.
Like HIV awareness. Okay, great. Start talking to people more about it. Be more open in the conversation about it. I think that we still kind of shuffle this away in a dark corner somewhere, and I'm really happy that Plus Life is here having these conversations because we need to talk about it.
Well, Mell McCracken, thank you for making the time. It's such an important topic. It is an epidemic, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think this is our biggest crisis that's facing our community today. And it's under talked about because of stigma, shame, and marginalization.
And we are all about throwing stigma and shame out the window here at Plus Life.
Yeah.
Thank you for making the time.
Yeah.
If
Pleasure.
you want more information about what we've talked about today, we're going to put some links up, especially in how you can connect with people. If you think maybe this is something I want to have a bigger conversation with, we'll make sure there's links below. So you've got resources. That is going to do it for this episode of Plus Talk. Thanks for watching. Thanks for making the time. Remember, you can follow us across social media platforms. We are at Plus Life Media. Until next time, be nice to everyone, but importantly, be nice to yourself. We'll see you soon.